Hi, I'm Professor Angus Kress Gillespie, your host on East Brunswick Television, and I'm here today with Professor Michael Aaron Rockland. His early career was with the U.S. Diplomatic Service, where he served as a cultural attaché in both Argentina and Spain. Currently, he's a professor at Rutgers University. Rockland is the author of some 14 books, 5 of which have achieved some special recognition. He's also a contributing editor at New Jersey Monthly magazine, and he's worked in both film and television production. He's lectured in some 23 countries around the world. I want to talk to him today about one of his most popular public lecture topics called What's American About America? So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Rockland to our studio today. Welcome, Michael. Today we're going to be talking about what's American about America. And as I recall, this all got started with the scholar John Couenhoven back in 1954, who wrote an essay by that title, What's American About America? Can you tell us a little bit about the theory behind his concept?
Yeah, he argued, and by the way, he had a list of 12 things he thought were typically American, but he argued that America was about process, whereas he felt that Europe was about product, that America was a nation that was improvising itself. And he also spoke about mobility. He said America is all about change. He thought Europe was well established. And I'm not sure that's still entirely true.
It's an interesting generalization.
Oh, yeah.
I recall later on he wrote another essay in which he said America could be represented by the Ferris wheel, whereas Europe could be represented by the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, and the Eiffel Tower obviously is a product. It doesn't move. It just stays put. And a Ferris wheel, which was invented, by the way, by an American whose name was Ferris, for the Columbia Exposition, 1893. Anyway, a Ferris wheel turns, it moves.
Yeah.
But not only that, you say set it up in a particular town, and then you're going to have a fair in the next town, and you take it apart, and you load it on trucks, and you take it to the next town, and you put it back together again. Whereas the Eiffel Tower obviously isn't going to be taken apart and put back together again.
Now,
move.
With reference to Couenhoven's list, let me mention a few of the items, and you can expand upon how that works or why it works.
Sure.
Let's start with jazz, for example.
Yeah, that's the one I like most on his list, because jazz is about improvisation. In fact, I don't make too many friends when I tell people, do you have a jazz record collection? They say, oh yes, I love jazz, I have a jazz record collection. I said, well, when you hear a record for the second time, it isn't jazz anymore. And they say, it isn't? What do you mean? And I say, well, it's because they're not improvising. You're hearing the same thing twice.
That's an interesting idea, yeah. And another item is the U.S. Constitution. Can you speak to that?
Sure. One of the things about the Constitution, obviously, is that it takes amendments. Therefore, it's not conceived of as a document which is carved in stone. I served in the diplomatic service years ago in Argentina, and in the 2 years I was there, they had 3 revolutions. And then I eventually looked at the Argentine Constitution. There was no possibility of amendments. And I wondered whether that was the reason why they were having so many revolutions, because there was not the notion that if something were bad enough or needed changing enough, you could do so.
So you could argue that our forefathers were very wise in putting that provision.
Sure, I think so, but I think a lot of Americans today are desperate for a new amendment, at least having to do with the Electoral College after 2 elections in which the person who won the popular vote didn't get to be the president. So there's great dissatisfaction about the fact that, and let's face it, back 20 years or so ago, we tried to pass the ERA, which was a simple amendment to say that women were actually people.
Yeah.
and we lost that by 2 states.
And it hasn't come back up again.
No, it hasn't, and I think women have made a lot of progress since then, so it's not such a pressing issue. But even though the Constitution is a document was supposed to be alive, and you could add to it and change it, it doesn't happen very often. Let's put it that way.
Michael, it seems that John Couenhoven also dealt with literature. I recall he mentioned Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. How does that work?
Well, Huckleberry Finn, let's face it, Huck and Jim are on the raft and they're just floating down the river. That's mobility, that's process, that's improvisation, that's change, as we mentioned before. So much so that I think, even though I love Huckleberry Finn, perhaps my favorite American work of literature, there's a serious defect in the book which underscores the point I'm making. When they reach Cairo, or Cairo as they pronounce it there, Illinois, they're supposed to stop and ditch the raft on the East Bank and make their way up the Ohio River until they get to the Free States. And they go past it in the middle of the night, but that doesn't matter. They could still pull to the bank and the East Bank, and they might still be able to maybe they've lost 1 day of hiking, let's say, but they don't. They just keep floating south. The book makes no sense after that, really. It makes sense, though, for his list because they just keep going. Americans are people who just, for better or worse, just keep going.
Yeah. I recall what Daniel Boone said, it was time to move on when he could see the smoke from his neighbor's chimney.
Sure, that explains a lot about New Jersey, the suburbs.
Yeah.
And the Jeffersonian notion that everybody ought to have their own land rather than live in cities. I think that's something both wonderful about New Jersey, but also not so wonderful about New Jersey because it undermines cities. It undermines centers of civilization.
And while we're on literature, there's Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass.
Yeah, you know, many people don't realize this, but Walt Whitman only wrote 1 book. In 1855, when the first edition came out, it had about 10 poems, and it was about this wide. And all he kept doing is improvising, if you will, adding to the 1 book. So that Leaves of Grass ended up this thick in the 11th edition. So the fact of just adding on, without making changes or corrections or anything like that, I think is also very American.
Yeah. And I guess you could argue Huckleberry Finn, Leaves of Grass, this is highbrow literature, relatively speaking. How about comic strips?
Yeah, well, the thing about comic strips is they never end. They have this endless quality to them. I remember years ago, I can't explain why, I was a Mary Worth fan. And Mary Worth is this do-gooder elderly lady. Well, here we are half a century later, and Mary Worth is still out there, hasn't aged a day, and she'll go on forever, I dare say.
And then there's, in terms of television, soap operas.
Absolutely, soap operas. Do they ever end? A little anecdote. I was giving some lectures, and they were over a period of time, and they met on Monday morning and Thursday afternoon. And on Monday morning, there were hundreds of people there, and on Thursday afternoon, there was almost nobody there. And I thought, what am I doing wrong on Thursday afternoon? Why aren't people here on Thursday afternoon? I asked the group the following Monday, what am I doing wrong on Thursday? I said, well, it's not you, Michael. They said, I said, so what is it? And they said, it's General Hospital. They were staying away from my lecture on Thursday because of General Hospital, which is still on.
Wow.
You know, so it's as if soap operas and comic strips just don't end.
I'm thinking of a connection here. As the world turns and turns and turns,
right?
It's similar. Yeah.
It's a very similar idea. Yeah.
And Kuenhoven mentioned assembly line production.
Yeah, I think in '54 that was a good item on our list because we were the ones who were doing more assembly line production than anyone else.
Now it's all in China.
Yeah, that's right. We're not doing very much of it. Yeah. So if he were doing his list today, I don't think he'd have that on there.
And almost comic relief, he mentions chewing gum.
Yeah, I had, and here's a little incident. That I had a foreign visitor recently, and picked them up at the airport. We were in Manhattan walking along, and she said, "Oh, I love your sidewalks." And I said, "What do you love them?" She said, "I love the polka dots. I love the polka dots on your sidewalks." Well, the polka dots were gum,
discarded gum.
Yeah, so there's that's the negative side, obviously, of gum, that people can't take 2 seconds to put it into a piece of paper or into a waste paper basket or flush it or whatever they need to do with it. But the other part of it is that foreign visitors who visit the United States, they all comment on the fact that Americans chew gum. And when you think of it, what are you doing when you're chewing gum? You're not getting any nutritional value.
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the dictionary definition is it's a confection that is chewed but not swallowed.
I like that. Yeah, right. So what's the point of it?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the point of chewing and chewing and chewing?
The only thing
doesn't make any sense, but I think it's representative of this mobility thing in Americans.
Well, I would suggest maybe it's stress release, maybe you're relieving stress.
Yeah, I mean, as you said that, I immediately thought of baseball, where everybody's chewing tobacco instead of gum, and I should think in any sport there's a certain amount of stress. Am I going to hit the home run or strike out or whatever? And baseball players are constantly chewing tobacco and spitting. So that's a very similar kind of thing, I think.
Now, you and I were talking about this the other day, and the truth is, Kuenhoven made his list in 1954. That's now more than 50 years ago. So I understand you've been updating the list with your own ideas.
Yes, and I have. I've been that presumptuous as to do so. He was a very great man. The first one that occurs to me is, while he mentions jazz, I mention rock and roll, rock and rap. And one thing we might say about that right away is all modern American music comes out of the African American community. Jazz, rock and roll, rock, and rap. 4 different forms of music, and they all come out of the African American community. And each time they were introduced, they were considered almost threatening until they entered the mainstream culture, and then they became, quote, respectable, unquote. But then when they became respectable, they lost some of that
revolutionary edge.
And energy and whatever, and I think it was time to produce a new kind of music. So now that every teeny bopper and every white teeny bopper in the suburbs is doing rap, I suspect the African American community is going to come up with yet a new music.
Well, you're onto something, I think, because if it originates in the African American community, it sort of percolates into the white community.
Yeah.
A good example, Fats Domino, recently deceased. Elvis Presley cheerfully acknowledged that Fats Domino was his inspiration.
Sure, and Fats Domino and Chuck Berry are the ones who really created rock and roll music. Elvis knew how to sing. That was about it.
I think you added movies to the list.
Yeah, even the word movies is so it moves. I mean, the correct name, I guess, is motion pictures, but that moves also. The fact that we call them that, we don't call them, as they do in Europe, cinema.
Yeah.
Or sometimes we say film, but the point is we generally say, I'm going to the movies. And I think that's related to Coudenhoven's idea of process, improvisation, mobility, etc. Same thing.
Now, we talked about Mark Twain. We talked about Huckleberry Finn. You mentioned road literature. So you're building on that tradition.
Yeah, and before I mentioned Huckleberry Finn, in a sense, as a road story, even though it's on a river.
Yeah.
It's moving. It's mobility. But if you look at our literature, you find an extraordinary percentage of it is mobile. It's moving from place to place.
Jack Kerouac.
Jack Kerouac's On the Road says it all.
Yeah.
But so many other movies are moving from place to place. There's a kind of a love affair with the automobile that's in so many movies. Or if not the automobile, the truck.
And landscape painting, tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I did a study of landscape painting at one time to try to see if there was something characteristic of American landscape painting as opposed to European landscape painting. And what I found, and there are exceptions of course, is that European landscape painting tended to have a tree on each edge of the canvas, which kind of blocked the notion that there was something beyond the canvas. And they'd have people, and they'd have houses, they'd have churches. In other words, civilization is very much in the European landscape. The one characteristic I find invariably in American landscape painting is the river. And the river, to quote Norman MacLean's wonderful novel in the movie made from it years ago, the river runs through it. So if the river's running through it, there's the notion that there's more landscape beyond the edge of the painting. And if you see people in an American landscape painting at all, and often you see none, they're tiny. You almost have to get up very close to see that that there's something going on. I think of the Hudson River School, for example, in the mid-19th century. It's all rivers. But since then as well, I think.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before, but I'm reminded of the paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe. She's out in the New Mexico desert, and it's just, the horizon is endless.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's always a sense that this is this is just a snapshot, and there's a whole lot of life beyond what she's painted.
So while we're on painting, tell us about Jackson Pollock.
Right. Well, some people consider Jackson Pollock America's greatest painter. I don't share that view, by the way.
Neither did Georgia O'Keeffe.
Right. I'm glad to hear that. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that. But let's face it, Jackson Pollock pushes abstract expressionism, which was more an American idea in the first place. I mean, America came to dominate painting in the world in the immediate post-World War II period with the abstract expressionists, sometimes called the action painters, by the way, action. And the ultimate action painter is Jackson Pollock, who rarely used a brush. He would pour his painting on. He'd lay his painting on the floor, 25 feet of paint, of canvas, and then he'd pour his painting or use sticks or whatever and throw the painting on there. And again, there are some art critics, I don't share their view, who consider him America's greatest genius. I don't have that feeling at all. I think he needed to have a little bit of finger painting or something when he was in elementary school. But there's nothing recognizable in his paintings, in other words. And he, in fact, he said it himself, I'm trying to capture action. Well, that could be a contradiction in terms. How do you capture action?
Yeah.
But there are people who love Jackson Pollock. I don't happen to, but I see him as quintessentially American. Let's put it that way.
Well, and arguably during that period of time, the capital of the art world shifted from Paris to New York.
It sure did.
Yeah.
It sure did. And that was a great achievement. I think Americans began to feel very proud of their culture in many ways, and perhaps until that period, we saw ourselves in many ways as doing the best we could to copy Europe. But now we suddenly were being celebrated as the center of the art world. And by the way, in this question of action, I'm very interested in the sculptor Alexander Calder. I don't know if Calder is our greatest sculptor, but he sure is our most American one. His idea is that sculpture should not just stand there and you walk around it. Let's see if you want to see the whole sculpture. He wanted the sculpture going around you. So all of his sculptures were, or virtually all of them, he called mobiles. And it's interesting, too, how this has been adapted by parents of a baby here in America. We're on the crib. I go in people's houses, they have a little baby, there's a little mobile, because all you got to do is blow a little bit of air on it, and it'll just start to move and move for a minute or so. And the baby, of course, looking up, loves the movement and is distracted by it. So Calder has moved into the culture in general, I guess I would
Yeah, so
say.
we've talked about painting, we've talked about sculpture. What about dance?
Well, that's one where, let's face it, modern dance, what we call modern dance, sometimes called jazz dancing, by the way, was really created here. Martha Graham was the first proponent of it. The notion of classical ballet, where you have certain positions and stuff, there are no positions in modern dance. Certainly it's rehearsed, but it's rehearsed to look like they're making it up. They want the dance to look like jazz sounds, if you will. But and I think that's quintessentially American as well. That ballet, our classical ballet, is not as favored in this country, I think, as modern dance is.
Let's move on to architecture.
Well, yeah, I think what's very typical of America is strip architecture. And we have a lot of it here in New Jersey. It's all over the place. The notion of stores being along highways. Why do people go to Europe? And why do they find Europe charming? They find it charming because every town or city you go to will have a central plaza, and then circles around that, or really squares around that, and then an outer wall, which they see as medieval and beautiful and like I think. Of course, the reason for that wall was defense. It was for pouring boiling oil down on whoever was trying to attack you and to shoot them with arrows. So the charm of the European city really has a rather dark history. We, very luckily, have not had to defend ourselves quite as much as Europeans had to over the centuries. And so the notion of just spreading out and along highways, and by the way, I think right here in New Jersey, we have the most extraordinary example of that I've ever seen anywhere, and that's Route 22 in the Springfield Union area, where you have an eastbound lane and a westbound lane, and you have supermarkets and malls on either side of it. But there's a central island as well, and there are two sets of stores there. You have four sets of stores along the highway, and if that isn't strip architecture, I don't know what is. Not to mention Las Vegas, of course.
And of course, we access these strip buildings by means of the automobile, whereas the European city is more walkable.
Yes, and it's let's face it, our automobiles are free us in some ways, but they imprison us in other ways. I think our cities would be a whole lot more interesting and more charming if we could get rid of the automobiles.
Yeah. Patchwork quilts.
Yeah, well, the thing about a patchwork quilt is that you could make one that the size is not limited. You could make one for a crib, you could make one for a single bed, you make one for a double or a queen, a king. The size, it's a little bit like Whitman's Leaves of Grass. You just can keep adding to it if you wish to. And though that has some origins in ancient China, it's very much an American artifact and craft, I think. You just ride along the road in New England and you'll see women making patchwork quilts today and having them on lines, ropes, and they're for sale, and they're very beautiful. But it's the endless quality, I think, which I would underscore.
And jeans?
Yeah, well, interestingly, jeans weren't called jeans when I was a kid. When I was a kid, they were called dungarees. Now, without getting too graphic about it, if you look at the first 4 letters of dungarees, it was for cowboys to shovel the manure.
Yeah.
That's what, and it's interesting that when Levi Strauss, who created Levi's, who's a Jewish immigrant who came from through Nîmes, France, on his way to the United States, he was immigrating, and he bought a lot of this cloth that the French would never wear. Only the poorest French would wear it. And he bought a lot of that tough cloth, and he went out to the California when the gold rush was going on, and started to create very tough pants that gold miners needed, and you know, and he called them dungarees, and of course one of the brands is Levi's. Yeah. But then what happened is, almost like jazz moving into mainstream culture and all the other forms of music, and as they become respectable, you move further on. So calling them jeans instead of dungarees, you could now charge twice as much for them.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to go further, you could have Gloria Vanderbilt's name written on your backside and charge even more. What's funny about jeans, of course, is that in recent years, people have been buying stressed jeans.
Yeah.
Jeans that have holes in them and cost even more. I have a whole closet full of such jeans, although I wore them out. I didn't buy them that way.
Well, you know, we've talked about Kuenhoven's list, and we've talked about how you've modified it. But I'd like to invite our viewers. They may have gotten ideas of their own watching our program.
Oh, absolutely.
Can we put up your email address on the screen, and maybe our viewers can send in suggestions to even further update your list?
I would like that very much. I'd be happy to communicate with anybody who wants to write to me. I enjoy that kind of back and forth.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, our viewers might come up with something we haven't even thought about.
I would bet on it.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I want to thank you for coming to East Brunswick Television today and sharing this very intriguing notion with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks.